Hey guys, it's Rick with the Digital Divide. Today we're going to be talking about the Sega Dreamcast. It's the last console that Sega has ever produced, and a console, in my opinion, that was way ahead of its time and died way too quick a death. This was a super impressive piece of hardware and featured an amazing library of games that still impresses today. This system was the first to wow me in the visual department. Now, when I saw the Nintendo 64 for the first time, there were a few games that really blew me away. Mario 64 and Wave Race 64 are two prime examples, but it wasn't until the Dreamcast that I really felt like we were taking a next step in the generation. It was the first time that a console, in my opinion, truly matched or exceeded the arcade experience. Games like House of the Dead, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Soul Calibur, they all looked as good or better than their arcade counterparts. This system is such a fantastic piece of hardware. Released by Sega on November 27th, 1998 in Japan and September 9th, 1999 in America, at a retail price of $199.99, this was Sega's last venture into console hardware. The system launched with several games. Those games were Arrow Wings, Air Force Delta, Blue Stinger, Expendable, Flag to Flag, House of the Dead 2, Hydro Thunder, Monaco Grand Prix, Mortal Kombat Gold, NFL 2K, NFL Blitz 2000, Pen Triathlon, Power Stone, Ready to Rumble Boxing, Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, TNN Motorsports Hardcore Heat, Tokyo Extreme Racer, and Trick Style. That is one hell of a launch lineup, and has not been matched, in my opinion, since. There have been one or two standouts. For example, when Microsoft launched with Halo, that was a huge exclusive, but it was one game. If you compare that to the Dreamcast, which had multiple exclusives that were of really high quality, in my opinion, it was a hell of a console. Electronic Arts refused to support the Sega Dreamcast. As a result, a company called Visual Concepts took over the mantle of the premier sports game creator for the Sega platform and created NFL 2K, which is still considered one of the best NFL games ever made. This football game, I gotta say, I'm not a huge sports guy when it comes to video games, but I loved this game and I thought it was amazing. EA would later go on to buy the exclusive gaming rights to the NFL, which killed off the franchise, unfortunately. The Dreamcast was the first in the sixth generation of video game consoles, preceding Sony's PlayStation 2, Nintendo's GameCube, and Microsoft's Xbox. Although the Dreamcast had a short lifespan and limited third-party support, reviewers have considered the console way ahead of its time. Its library contained many games considered innovative, including Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Phantasy Star Online, and Shenmue, as well as high-quality ports of Sega's Naomi arcade system board games. The Dreamcast was also the first console to include a built-in modular modem for internet support and online play. In contrast to the expensive hardware of the unsuccessful Sega Saturn, the Dreamcast was designed to reduce costs with off-the-shelf components, including a Hitachi SH4 CPU and a NEC Power VR 2 GPU. The Dreamcast delivered 1.4 gigaflops of power. Its 100 MHz NEC Power VR rendering engine, integrated with the system's ASIC, is capable of drawing more than 3 million polygons per second. Sega estimated the Dreamcast was theoretically capable of rendering 7 million raw polygons per second, or 6 million with textures and lighting, but noted that game logic and physics reduced peak graphic performance. Ultimately, I think the Dreamcast failed due to loss of consumer trust after Sega's early abandonment of unsuccessful hardware such as the Sega CD, Sega 32X, and the Sega Saturn. And this was despite the fact that they had backing by Microsoft. On May 21st, 1998, Microsoft proudly announced its partnership with Sega on the Dreamcast. They would go on to provide the operating system known as Windows CE that the Dreamcast used to run. Microsoft would later go on to start their own console called the Xbox, but Sega had all the backing by this behemoth with development of the Dreamcast and still failed, and I think the lack of third-party support, coupled by the fact that PlayStation 2 was looming in the background and was the biggest video game console in town and significantly more powerful than the Dreamcast, would launch less than a year after the Dreamcast did. Sega was also way ahead of its time when it came to memory. The Dreamcast used a VMU, which had its own LCD screen and D-pad as well as buttons. It was capable of playing its own games. VMU stands for Visual Memory Unit, and that's because the memory card was capable of playing its own games. And this was really impressive at the time. You could plop it into the Dreamcast and it would serve as a secondary display on the controller for games that supported it, or a standalone gaming device for simple LCD games. The Dreamcast was also impressively small. In contrast to previous Sega consoles, the Dreamcast was tiny and packed a lot of power in a small unit. I remember going to the local mall when I was younger and stopping by the Babbage's, and they had a demo display running of the Dreamcast, and it was a console that always fascinated me. So, guys, I'm going to leave you with a handful of games that really stood out to me. They're in no particular order, and a lot of these are actually ports. The first one is the Dreamcast port of Quake 3. This was a PC game that I loved to death growing up, and I thought the Dreamcast port was absolutely mind-blowing. Keep in mind that we had had previous ports for Quake games, such as Quake 1 on the Sega Saturn and Quake 2 on the PlayStation 1, but Quake 3 was the first port in the series that was a match for PC, in my opinion. The second one, along the same lines, was Unreal Tournament for the Dreamcast. I thought that this was a rock-solid port. I played the hell out of this game. Another great game is Trickstyle. I mentioned this game earlier. It was one of the launch titles on the system. I think it had an amazing soundtrack. Take a listen. Yeah, I really like the music in this game. And I thought the game had a really stylistic vibe going for it. I loved it. Another great game on the system was Hydro Thunder. This was a racing game where you controlled a boat and you were running around. It was kind of like Wave Race on the N64. Granted, it's more arcadey. It's not as physics-based as Wave Race on the N64, but I had a lot of fun with it. Another one that I can't not mention is Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. This was arguably Sonic's first successful foray into 3D, although I really like Sonic Jam on the Saturn. That was more of a collection rather than a standalone game, but this was the first time post-Mario 64 that people got to control Sonic in a 3D space. Another standout title was Crazy Taxi. This was a really fun arcade-style racer where you were dropping people off at their destination, accompanied by an amazing soundtrack by The Offspring. The last game I want to mention here is Soul Calibur. This game absolutely blew me away, and I had never played the arcade version, but man, when I played it on the Dreamcast, I had never seen anything so beautiful before. This game was absolutely stellar, and continues today to be a gorgeous game, and the gameplay holds up 100%. So guys, this was my retrospective on the Dreamcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching. This has been another Digital Divide retrospective.